These lectures are primarily about alcoholism, but most of what I say also applies to other drug addictions. On the one hand, the prescription drugs like tranquilizers, barbiturates, codeine compounds, and on the other, the street drugs like heroin, cocaine, and yes, marijuana. Marijuana is an addictive drug for far more people than we have thought. It's just that it has a more gradual, less dramatic onset, so we've overlooked it. Now, there are some very important differences between alcohol and the other drugs, and I'll comment on those in the lectures, but the similarities are overriding. Similarities in the chemistries of addiction in the brain, reflected in cross-tolerance and cross-addiction. Similarities in the progressiveness of the addictive disease, in the transformation of personality and character, and in the requirements for effective intervention and treatment. But first, some reorientation is necessary because our overall view of alcoholism has always been inverted and distorted by a set of false beliefs. And these beliefs are still dominant in the academic and professional communities, in the alcoholism literature, in the communications media, and in the whole of society. And the core beliefs have spawned hundreds of supporting beliefs in a rich fabric of misinformation and confusion. Attacking the beliefs one at a time as they pop up is sort of like the Hydra in Greek mythology, the nine-headed serpent. You cut off one head and two grow back in its place. So we have to get to those core beliefs, point out that they're false, get them out of the way, and make room for all of the factual knowledge to come together freely. Now, the first of these core beliefs is that alcoholism is caused by heavy drinking. That anybody would be an alcoholic if they drank that much. If you are an alcoholic, it's because you did drink too much. And that requires that we have an explanation of heavy drinking. The standard answer is that people drink to relieve the stress of living. That people use alcohol as an anesthetic drug. That alcohol is primarily a sedative drug, if not exclusively a sedative drug, and people are drinking to anesthetize themselves. Why would alcoholics do that more than other people? Well, either because they have more psychological and social problems, more severe problems to cope with, or they're less adequate in coping with the problems. So they turn to alcohol, drink too much, and become alcoholics. What's wrong with these beliefs? Everything. First of all, alcoholism is a hereditary disease. It's there not only before the heavy drinking, it's before any drinking at all. Second, alcohol is not even primarily a sedative drug. In the amounts consumed at the start of alcoholism, which is after all what we're trying to explain, alcohol is a primary stimulant. It makes those billions of cells that make up the brain more easily stimulated and to a higher level of response. It's a turn on. And right when the brain is becoming more easily stimulated, more active, alcohol provides the energy that's needed. Alcohol converts to calories at a rate higher than other carbohydrates. And it's an easier source. It doesn't have to be digested. And so the stimulation and energy are the reasons people drink beverage alcohol. Now, the third point is that one of the most heavily researched areas in the whole field of alcoholism has been the almost desperate attempt to validate these beliefs by showing that psychological and social problems cause later alcoholism or contribute. And there have been hundreds of such studies, and they've all come up empty-handed. Because of the thoroughness of this research, it's only fair to summarize the opposite of what people were looking for. Psychological and social problems not only don't cause alcoholism, they don't even appear to contribute. Now, of course, psychological and social and cultural factors play a big part in whether people drink, when they drink, what they drink, how they drink, and even how much they drink. No question about that. But that's what alcoholics have in common with everybody else. That's what's normal about them. What's abnormal is how alcohol affects them when they drink. Now we come to the really exciting news in alcoholism. This whole fabric of false beliefs is coming up for review and challenge because of three major forces in the field of alcoholism that are converging and colliding. The first of these is the recent thrust of the false beliefs in what appears to be a kind of final spasm before they collapse. Second is the grassroots programs inspired by Alcoholics Anonymous that are having a major impact on the treatment of alcoholics and other drug addictions. And the third one is the emergence of basic scientific knowledge of alcoholism in a coherent pattern. So we'll look briefly at each of these three to see how they are impacting and what the probable outcome will be. We say alcoholism is a disease of denial, that alcoholics are unwilling to seek help with their problems. This is an example of a very distorted half-truth, because as a matter of fact, alcoholics are constantly seeking help. I'm going to use the terms establishment and professional to refer to all of the helping agencies in society, health, facilities, public and private, public assistance and whatever. There are thousands of different agencies, and we'll add in all the major professions, physicians, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, nurses, and others. There are millions of them. Alcoholics are in virtually all of those caseloads. The problem is that their alcoholism is either undiagnosed or wrongly diagnosed, and then the patient is inadequately or harmfully treated. For example, it's common practice still to prescribe tranquilizers for alcoholics with or without psychotherapy to get at the deep underlying psychological causes of their problem, a practice which only aggravates and compounds the basic addictive disease and makes patients worse instead of better. In the emergency rooms, the health crises and injuries are treated, and the alcoholic is sent on his way with at best the advice not to drink so much. Well, alcoholics try that. As soon as problems develop, and from time to time when they have an incentive, like trying to prove they're not alcoholics, alcoholics institute controls. They may go on the wagon for varying periods of time, drink only after a certain hour of the day, drink only on weekends, switch from hard liquor to beer or wine to cut down on the concentration of alcohol, and so forth. Now, these are strategies that work very well for millions of non-alcoholics when they take up drinking and are learning to calibrate their intake. But for the alcoholic, these are only temporary measures. Incidentally, periods of controlled alcoholic drinking are regularly mistaken for a return to normal drinking by naive researchers. But that's another part of the story. And so the problem of alcoholism continues to get worse, and the problems multiply, and the alcoholic keeps coming back for help. One survey found that alcoholics consult psychiatrists 30 times as often as non-alcoholics, and they're hospitalized 12 times as often. Because of these repeated contacts, it's estimated that alcoholics comprise some 50% of all caseloads. The annual cost is in the hundreds of billions of dollars. The whole of the establishment is a gigantic revolving door for alcoholics. In the prisons, the situation is even worse. People who work there and know alcoholism report that well over 80% of people in prison are there for crimes secondary to alcoholism. And because the alcoholism isn't diagnosed or treated there either, the recidivism or repeat arrest rate is about as high as the alcoholism rate. Now, to put all of the blame for all of this frustrating and destructive behavior on alcoholic denial is a superficial and cruel response. Alcoholic denial is the mirror image of professional denial of the primary addictive disease. Now, I hope everybody will understand that I'm not attacking the professional community. That, too, would be a superficial response. With such a colossal failure by so many millions of professionals, otherwise well qualified, to deal adequately with this #1 public health problem, we have to know that something far more basic is wrong. And that brings us back to the belief system. Now, I want to be sure everybody's clear that I'm not attacking, and I think it'll be a lot easier to be sure that's clear if I read something I wrote to a friend on this subject very recently. And so let me just read that. It's brief. I'm sure that when the earth was flat, nobody even knew it was a belief, much less that it was false. The flat earth was just a given, a part of everyone's reality. When the evidence was presented that the earth was round, the clash of ideas was intense and devastating to a lot of people who ignored, denied, distorted, or tried to suppress the evidence. But the attack was on the flat earth belief, not on the people who had always believed it. Just so in these lectures, I'm not attacking people or groups of people. I'm attacking the age-old, universally shared false beliefs. The establishment revolving door experience has been the passive expression of the false beliefs, but there's also, in the last decade or so, been a very active thrust of these beliefs. So let's take a look at that. By an act of Congress, the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, NIAAA, was created, and it got underway about 1971. The first director of NIAAA was a psychiatrist who on many occasions said, alcoholism is not a disease, it's a symptom of some psychological problem. And he was there for 6 years, so he got to set policy and staff the agency in his own image. Now, the first major effort of one of the first major efforts of NIAAA was to treat the Skid Row alcoholic. So they set up a major program just outside Washington, D.C., heavily staffed and funded. The treatment modality was psychotherapy and tranquilizers. Well, the program bombed. The recovery rate was 0. So they said, well, these people are too tough. They're too far gone. We'll go more into the private sector patients. And they funded a lot of programs to test out, to make comparisons. They had some hospital-based, some non-hospital, some inpatient, some outpatient, long-term, short-term. And in the middle 70s, they hired the Rand Corporation to see how they were doing. Rand found that the recovery rates were just about 0 for these programs. There was no difference among programs. They were all pretty close to 0. Now, that didn't get reported to the public. It was embarrassing. Attention was diverted to the allegation that maybe they don't have to stay sober and that perhaps they had found some alcoholics who could return to normal drinking. That was later disproven, but that was what got to the public. Well, then, meanwhile, NIAAA was funding a number of people around the country to try to deliberately teach alcoholics to drink normally. And the first reports claimed that they had done so, but later follow-up studies showed that those earlier reports were false, that alcoholics simply couldn't go back to normal drinking. So having failed to treat alcoholism effectively, the next major effort was prevention. And during the middle 70s, the NIAAA sponsored a program that pretty much blitzed the schools of America. The message was, if you drink responsibly, you won't have to worry about becoming an alcoholic. Well, the message was false, we'll see in these lectures, and the effect was to seduce millions of genetically susceptible kids into the trap of addiction. And we did see a steady increase in drinking and alcoholism right after that program. Now, all that sounds pretty negative, but notice that having consistently failed to validate the beliefs that they set out to prove, we can see that they performed a useful public service. They debunked the beliefs in the process. Now, I have to point out that denial of addiction is still with us and very vigorous and strong in our language. We use the terms alcohol abuse and drug abuse instead of alcohol addiction and drug addiction. Notice that the term abuse implies that the victim is in control, that he willfully or carelessly overdid it. He took too much, and that's why he got in trouble, again implying that next time out he can be more careful. So we preserve the fiction for the alcoholic that maybe he can go back to normal drinking, and for the drug addict, we preserve the idea that there's something called recreational use of drugs, and that the drug addict can learn to be more careful with his drug use. So we protect the fiction of recreational use of drugs by the term drug abuse, and the real problem in America is drug use. Now we come to the second of the three forces that are colliding, the advent of the successful grassroots programs inspired by the Alcoholics Anonymous program. AA was founded in 1935 by some alcoholics, and they didn't spend a lot of time hassling or arguing about the causes of alcoholism. They had a higher priority. They knew one thing for sure. If they could find a way to stay sober, they could return to sanity and have a chance to live normal lives. And they found a way. And very soon, early members of AA recognized the need and moved into the community and created all kinds of halfway houses, treatment centers, detoxification centers, rehabilitation programs, and so forth. Now, those programs have been uneven, but on the whole, they've been successful. And it's a safe summary that the majority of alcoholics who escape the revolving doors of the establishment into the grassroots programs do recover. Now, it's important to realize that a very small but very important group of professionals have come over to join the grassroots programs, first to learn and then to provide leadership. Some of the grassroots programs have moved into hospitals and other establishment facilities, but if they insist on total abstinence from alcohol and substitute drugs, they're still part of the grassroots movement. Now, with the continuing frustration of the revolving door in the establishment, with the collapse of the direct effort to validate the false beliefs, turning out to be a debunking of them, and with the growing pressure of the grassroots programs demonstrating that alcoholics can recover, the stage is set for the emergence of the third force that's colliding, the emergence of the scientific knowledge of alcoholism. I first got into the field of alcoholism full-time in 1966 as research director in a pharmaceutical house supervising both animal and human research studies. Now, this job required that I not only be familiar with the alcoholism literature, but also with the more basic source materials in the various life sciences, biochemistry, physiology, pharmacology, epidemiology, etc. And I was astounded at what I found there, because scattered all over the landscape of the life sciences were facts about alcoholism that had not been welcome or incorporated into the alcoholism literature. And so I tried to fit them into that literature, and they wouldn't fit. So then I got the idea, well, they're valid, why not put them together with each other? And so I started doing that and adding more facts and more, and at a certain point, they all fell into place, into their own natural pattern, and then sort of in a rush, all of the other factual material came together. Now, this was a very exciting discovery. It wasn't a theory or a philosophy. It was a new gestalt, a new perception of the entire field of alcoholism. It was simply what anyone could see, presented with all of the valid scientific knowledge across disciplines, together with all of the valid clinical knowledge of the disease and the recovery process. And I knew it would have to emerge first in the alcoholism field and then in the whole of society. And to start the process, I published this new perception in 1970 in a monograph titled The Emergent Comprehensive Concept of Alcoholism, expanded and more fully documented in 1974. And I let it go out of print after the publication of Under the Influence in hardcover in 1981 and in Bantam paperback in 1983. And the book is used ever more widely as a text in the education and training of counselors and as required reading for patients in many treatment programs. Well, the emergent concept is emerging, and at an accelerating rate. By 1985, several major universities had announced they were inaugurating courses in the disease of alcoholism in their medical schools. And we can expect many others to follow suit. And the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism has come more than halfway over. Now, they still don't have the whole gestalt, but in 1985, NIAAA published a booklet titled Alcoholism, an Inherited Disease, in which they concur from the research evidence that alcoholism is a hereditary disease, and that at least for many alcoholics, psychological and social factors are not contributing causes. And that's a really big step. Meanwhile, since 1970, I've been traveling the country giving public lectures and workshops. And on such a trip to Washington, D.C. recently, I had the pleasure of having dinner with Lauren Archer, acting director of NIAAA. Well, when we met, he gave me a big grin and said, "Well, Jim, after all these years, you're finally winning. We've shifted the lion's share of our research budget over to the biological basis of alcoholism." Now, my advice in viewing these lectures is to do what I did originally. If you try to take each fact that I present and relate it to what you already know, it probably won't work. It'll probably bounce off or be confusing. So take one fact at a time, put it together with another. Alcoholism is hereditary. That must mean it's physical. Sure enough, the mechanisms of addiction. Put one fact together with another, and at some point I hope you have that exciting experience of this new gestalt, this new perception. And if you do, you'll realize that we have a more thorough understanding of alcoholism than any other chronic disease. We know who's alcoholic and why. We know the mechanisms in the brain and liver. We know how and why the disease progresses. We know its signs and symptoms, how to identify it, how to diagnose it, and most importantly, how to intervene and treat the disease effectively so the majority of alcoholics can make full recoveries. So that's what these lectures are all about, bringing together enough of the scientific and clinical knowledge of alcoholism to create this new gestalt, this new comprehensive perception of alcoholism. And then we also see very clearly that the same change in perception is needed in order to understand the other drug addictions. Who are these lectures for? For everyone. Because the whole of society, collectively and individually, has an urgent need to know what to do about this #1 public health problem. In Lecture 2, Alcoholism is Hereditary, we'll look at the animal and human research studies that show that alcoholism is a constitutional hereditary problem. And we'll see how and why there are such extreme variations in alcoholism rates and attitudes toward alcohol in various ethnic or racial groups. Then in Lecture 3, Mechanisms of Addiction, we'll review the primary physical mechanisms in the brain and liver that explain the onset and progression of alcoholism. Lecture 4, Releasing the Alcoholic, brings together all of the information in these lectures to remove the stigma and shame from alcoholics, get to their real problem, and show clearly What must be done about it?